Hello, I'm Somalia.
And I'm Jasmine, and we're back for another incredible season of Fusion Talk Show. You know, Somalia, for too long, we've been blind to past injustices and how they continue to shape the present. President Barack Obama was spot on when he made that statement about all the injustices that are happening in the world right now.
And you know what, Jazz? In August of 2014, when teenager Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, this started, it awakened a movement that somewhat started in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed by Neighborhood Watch volunteer George Zimmerman. This movement is known as Black Lives Matter.
From police brutalities to random acts of hate towards minority groups, there's a lot of stuff going on, and we need to talk about it. In our episode, Know Your Rights, we're going to talk about how youth can be involved in the movement positively, but also demand their justice. Let's talk about it.
Telling you all we know. Watch and see how you will grow, 'cause teens and parents are bridging lines of communication on Fusion.
Fusion Talk Show.
Although women started the Black Lives Matter movement, we often see that women and their families get lost in the dialogue on police brutality.
Join me in welcoming women's rights advocate from the Feminist Women's Health Center, Kwajelyn Jackson. Welcome to Fusion.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
Ms. Jackson, my first question is, when people think about a lot of the police brutality, they think about the men that are affected and the men who have died, but there's a lot of women that are affected and women who have died. So how do women play a role in the movement, and how have they been affected? Because I think that their stories aren't told sometimes.
It's absolutely true. I think that one of the untold stories about the Black Lives Matter movement is that the phrase Black Lives Matter was coined and founded by women.
Right.
And that women tend to be on the front lines of many social justice movements. They're the people who are marching, organizing, doing a lot of the grunt work behind the scenes. And we've always been really present and showing up when Black men are affected by police violence or by street violence.
Right.
But women are very often victims of violence by the state, by their domestic partners, and also within the prison systems.
I'm curious as to why the stories of the women aren't shown in the media.
I mean, I think it's a lot of reasons. I think there's underrepresentation about the plights of women in lots of ways. I do think that there is a particular thread around Black men and Black masculinity in a way that shows up in violence that sometimes takes up more space. And I think that sometimes because the perpetrators of violence against women are men, that there may be some ways that prevents their stories from being told as authentically as they could be.
I want to know how, I guess, we can get involved in our local grassroots communities. There's elections coming up, and I think people get all into the presidential elections, but they don't really even know who the representatives are. They don't know about their local communities. So how important is that to teens, and how can we get more involved?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, especially during a presidential election year, local and state politics take a back seat. But so much of the decisions that are made that affect our everyday lives are decided at state capitol buildings and not at Washington, D.C. So it's really important to know who your representative and senator is, know who your city council is, know who your school board are. Like, those positions yield a lot of power. For young people, if you're 18 or going to be 18 before the election, register to vote. There's lots of organizations on the ground in different localities that are working on specific pieces of the work. So racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, reproductive justice. So doing a little bit of Googling to find the area that you really want to plug into. Those are the things that I would recommend, because there's lots of roles for people at any age.
I think it's like you talked about, finding what you're interested in. Everyone's interested in something, because you have hobbies, you have things that you love to do, and your representatives have to do that.
Yeah, I think what's really important at all levels, federal, state, and local, is to remember that they work for you.
Right.
That you are in control of the hiring and firing with your vote, and that when they're in office, it's their role to be accountable to the needs of their constituents.
Right.
So writing them a letter, sending them an email, going to their office,
Yeah.
they have to respond.
And also going to meetings, community meetings and stuff like that. My aunt always made me, you have to go to your community meetings. And I was like, what, why? But it's really, I learned things that they're fixing these roads and not, I'm like, okay, so why are we doing that? So I want to know for other teens that maybe feel like they don't have a role, how can they find a role? And for the teens that are kind of indifferent, there's a lot of indifferent young people, because it's easy to be indifferent. What do you say to those young people that are indifferent and kind of feel like it doesn't apply to them?
Sure. Well, I think that, like you said before, playing off of the skills and interests that you already have is really important. So kind of combing through your life, if you're a really good artist, there's a lot of ways you can employ art in social movements. I think another thing is I know that sometimes people discount social media and kind of armchair activism, but I think it plays a role too.
Yeah, I think it does too.
I think that raising awareness, having conversations with your peer group, talking to people in your school, all of those things matter and hold weight, and they can be contributing factors to making big social change.
That's so cool. So even by sending a tweet and showing that you support something, you're impacting the movement, even if you're not going out marching and holding a sign. And I think that's really important to know. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure, my pleasure.
Stay tuned, because when we come back from commercial break, we're going to go more in depth about the Black Lives Matter movement. Stay connected with Fusion on Facebook,
Twitter,
Instagram, and YouTube.
Tamir Rice, Dejira Becton, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Jessica Hernandez, all adolescents who are victims of police brutality. It's time for teens to join the conversation, so we're not just minimized to just another hashtag.
On the Fusion set, we have advocates, Eldredge Washington and Xavier Best. Welcome to Fusion, guys.
Thank you for having us here.
So first, I want to clear up some things that are in the air. So oftentimes when we see the hashtag Black Lives Matter, somebody replies and says that all lives matter. So can you guys tell us what the difference is between the two movements?
Sure. I know from personal experience, I found that the phrase Black Lives Matters is usually meant to signify Black people fighting for civil rights and social justice. And when you see the phrase All Lives Matter used, typically it's used to undercut whatever agenda Black Lives Matter is pushing. And I think you can see this most clearly because the people who advocate All Lives Matter, they're never consistent in their messaging and their actions. So I think it's important that we use our discrimination of mind and use our reasoning to see through that kind of rhetoric.
Definitely, and I definitely think that somewhat people, like these things have been happening, but I guess with the help of social media, it's just helping to even bring them more forward. So what would you say?
I mean, I would completely agree with him. Also, the only thing I would add to that, all lives matter, this is not our first time hearing the word all. I feel like when the people say all lives matter, they mean it the same way when Thomas Jefferson said all men are created equal. And if you think about the Declaration of Independence, when they signed that, African Americans, we were slaves. In the same way they say all lives matter, they mean all lives except Black Lives Matter. That's why they don't join our movement. They don't fight and they don't yell. They don't change their profile picture to the red, black, and green, but they'll change it to everything else.
And so, speaking with you, Mr. Best, what do you think, how do you think the Black Lives Matter movement is somewhat like the civil rights movement?
And I think this, as the preface to what I say, I think it's necessary to do a lot of analysis of what the civil rights movement was.
Right.
Because I think today, as millennials and young people, we've been subjected to a lot of mythology about the civil rights movement.
Right.
Specifically in the person of Dr. King, he's typically portrayed as a kind of person who's non-threatening, very pacifistic, very open to everything.
thing. But I think if you look at his life and look at how he was talked about in his time, he was a pariah. He was treated very much like an outsider, very much as somebody who was threatening the status quo. And I think Black Lives Matter is doing precisely the same thing that King was doing. You can find editorials written during this period where he was fighting for justice that described him as someone who would incite violence. He was engaged in violence-provoking forays in white neighborhoods that would bring resentment in the white community and ultimately lead to political defeat. So you see the same kind of rhetoric used towards Black Lives Matter, you know, calling them terrorists, FBI spying on them. So there's a lot of, I think, congruities between what Dr. King was doing and what Black Lives Matter is doing. And that education, I think, once that's put in place, we can see the connection between what they're doing today, Black Lives Matter, and what King was doing in his time.
And what would you say are the differences between the two movements?
I think the difference is Black Lives Matter is a lot more expansive in what they're targeting. King, as we all know, from 55 to about the March and Selma 65, he was targeting Jim Crow. And that was like segregated public accommodations, and they had the Voting Rights Act, they had the Civil Rights Act, Lyndon Johnson signed. And that was kind of seen as a way of achieving political freedom for Black people. Black Lives Matter, I think, is a more explicitly human rights movement because we're talking about people being killed in a very systematic way, being lynched in the judicial system, where you have all these court cases where officers are killing Black people and they're getting off with it. There's a good website called mappingpoliceviolence.org, and they actually track the number of deaths of Black people by police. And the latest figure shows 307 Black people have been killed, and 98% of those cases resulting in no prosecution for the police.
Wow.
So, and I think of an analogy as like if you lived in a country and it was an election and one of the candidates got 98% of the vote, you would think there was some rigging in the electoral system. But we look at that in the judicial system and we don't come to the same conclusion. So Black Lives Matter, they're kind of attacking that kind of systemic injustice that's very covert but very real, I think, in the experiences of Black people.
And Eldredge, what would you say is a way that teens can get involved with this movement positively? Because we see all these different things that young people are doing, but how can they get in the movement and make a real change?
Okay, first of all, even to your point, getting in the movement in a positive way. If you are joining the Black Lives Matter movement and you're making real progression, real work, that means you are challenging a power structure that is in place. So it will never be looked at as positive. Just as Dr. King, his work was not looked at as positive. Rosa Parks was not looked at as positive. Assata Shakur, Harriet Tubman was not looked at as positive. So I don't want the young people to be discouraged when they are talked about in a negative way from mainstream media, because mainstream media has always done a really good job at oppressing the people that were fighting for our rights. But the number one thing that I challenge our young people to do to get involved is, number one, educate yourself. And if you educate yourself, what I mean by that, we have a blueprint. Right now, I feel like Black Lives Matter, they are a construction team trying to build a new future. And we have a blueprint. The Civil Rights Movement was a blueprint. And if we go back and study everyone that was a part of that movement, their successes, their failures, if we study them and see what they've done, we'll see that they're very, very similar to what we're fighting against now. And we can use that to build an even stronger foundation for our children to live in.
And so what would you say to teens who want to join the movement, but they don't want to be on the front line? Like maybe they don't want to be, you know, protesting within the crowd. Like, can they take the back seat? Like, how can they still be involved in the movement?
That's a good question. Number one, I would really suggest you join a research team. Like Xavier said, there's the website mappingpoliceviolence.org. Really having information like that is what helps activists like me and Xavier actually learn what do we need to target next. So in your community, learn who your local representatives are. Learn the laws that are in place. They call them broken window laws. Just these small laws that are used so that you can begin to profile people in these lower income communities. So learn what those laws are so you can begin to challenge them. So in the back scene, really doing research, educating your community on the issues that's going on. There are so many. We all know the commercial names, the mainstream names: Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice. Like, we know those, but how many know Kevin Davis? How many know Troy Robinson? How many know Anthony Hill? These are names that didn't get the mainstream of attention on the news. So really, being that person that's educating, and you can do that in several ways. Talk to your peers. Social media is a good one. My only thing, before you share, before you promote anything on social media, do your research.
Yes.
Because there are a lot of things that are going out that are false on both sides, from the Black Lives Matter side as well as the mainstream media side. So that'll be my information if you want to get involved and not necessarily be in the forefront.
And what would you guys say, like, where do you see the Black Lives Matter movement going from here? Like, are we going up? Are we pushing forward? Like, where do you think it's going from here?
I think when analyzing any political movement, it's always important to note that there's going to be a lot of setbacks. So there isn't any kind of straight trajectory from 0 to 100 whenever you're dealing with any kind of activist movement. So I think right now it looks like it's evolving more in a way that is impacting the electoral process. So we see a lot of the national election, we see they interrupting speeches of Bernie Sanders, or we see them interrupting speeches of Donald Trump. And I think that's a good thing, even though tactically they are being criticized. And that's another thing that's similar to King. King's tactics were criticized in the same way that the Black Lives Matter's tactics are criticized. So it's important to note, though, that they're doing this because I think they understand that by making themselves visible on such a mainstream stage is changing the conversation. It's forcing people to talk about the elephant in the room. And I think the elephant in the American room is, white supremacy and racism. So this is something that people just have to tackle. They can't avoid it. And I think Black Lives Matter should be commended for doing that and bringing that to the consciousness of the public.
And I think, I agree. I actually think we are going forward. When you think about what Xavier just said, think about every other presidential election before. How many times has the story of race been on the table like this? We talk about everything else. We talk about jobs. We talk about health care. We talk about international policies. But how many times have we talked about Black lives? So you have to give the credit to the Black Lives Matter movement. I feel like the reason why we are going to go forward is because as long as we can talk about it, as long as we can keep it on the table and we can keep this target in front of us, we will begin to keep consciousness rising. And that's what's happening. The more people are being aware to what's going on in this country and they want to get involved.
And a lot of people said that the only reason that the university in Missouri decided to dismiss the president is because of the money that they were going to lose. Do you think that teens or even youth how can they be empowered by their economic status, using that to their advantage? I
think if we could somehow generate the kind of economic leverage in the Black community and use that in the political arena, it would make a transformative change in the country as a whole. And I know Eldredge, he's working on his own company, and I'm the writer for that company. It's called Spendify, and maybe he could talk some more about that.
And I agree. So when you think about Dr. King, before he passed, his agenda was the Poor People's Campaign, and it was all economics. So I am one that is so for protest, and I'm the first in the streets. But I will say this, we do not have to do another protest. We don't have to do another die-in. We don't have to do another tweet, as long as we just shift our spending power. In the African-American community, we have $1.3 trillion that we use and we spend every day. When it comes to Black businesses in our community, they only get 3% of that. There's only 2 million Black-owned businesses in this country. With that being said, if we shift that 3% simply to 10%, that's 7 points. Those businesses are now what we call in a surplus. They're in the black. They're 100% successful businesses. With that being said, how can we use economics to change our problem? We just have to change the way we spend. I tell people every day, our generation, I think we get it twisted. Dr. King, I don't think when they were doing what they were doing, they didn't see what we see right now. We see people being courageous and standing up. They were just doing what was right in that time. So what we have to do is realize we got to realize that our children are going to begin to look at us the way we're looking at Dr. King. And you got to decide, do you want to fit in society now or stand out in history later? And the way you do that is realizing that this is the modern day Montgomery bus boycott, and we have to stand up by spending our money the right way.
And I totally agree, because even today, like even back then, like people did not agree with Martin Luther King, and there were still people who didn't want to be involved in the movement. But this is our time now, and I hope that you're able to find out and figure out where you want to be and where you stand in this movement.
That was so much information, but we're not done yet. When we come back, our audience will be able to ask our guests any questions in our Fusion Kickback. We'll be right back.
Hi everybody, I'm Somalia.
And I'm Jasmine.
And we're the hosts of
Fusion Talk Show.
So now that we know exactly what bullying is and what it looks like, we need to know how to prevent it.
I think we need to do a few things. Number one is educate people. We're destroyed for lack of knowledge. And what happens is people don't know. If they're not aware of the problem, then we can't form a solution.
Why do you think that a lot of teens aren't comfortable to talk to their parents about like personal things?
I feel that, parents, at the same time that they were teens before, times were different back then. So it's almost like the problems that we deal with may be the same, but different, tailored to our time.
How do teens separate, I guess, fake and reality and digital technology from actual real life?
Teens, you gotta know who you are, find your niche in what you do, because what's gonna make you stand out is you just being different in who you are, not flowing with everybody else. So.
Welcome back to the Fusion Kickback. We're here with our Fusion audience, and they're gonna have a chance to ask our guests some questions, and we're gonna talk more in depth about social movements. So I first would like to know, has anybody ever gotten pulled over before by a police officer? And if so, what was your experience like?
I've been pulled over a few times, and every experience I've had, I always felt like the police officers were being defensive towards me, and I didn't like that. If I ever tried to explain myself, they would just threaten to up my fine or increase what was happening to me and make it worse. And it kind of makes me wonder, like, who checks the police? Who checks that? Nobody checks. There's supposed to be checks and balances, but no one checks that entity in our society.
So does anyone else feel like, even when like you just see the cops driving past you, your heart starts to beat, or you feel some type of anxiety?
I do. And I feel like that is a sign how you know there's a problem. And it's funny when you hear different race groups talk about police, there's always a different perspective. When you hear our Caucasian counterparts, they talk about police officer, it's more from they're here to protect us. It's a good thing when a police officer's here. And even us, we're putting it between a rock and a hard place, because even when you need the police officers, you might not want to call them because you don't know if it's going to escalate to that level where someone is killed or they abuse their power. So I feel like that there in itself is just a sign that we have an issue, a systemic issue, and it has a lot more to do with training.
So do y'all think that there is like a certain protocol? Like, so when you are pulled over, like, because a lot of people say that you should act a certain way, or, you shouldn't say certain things. Do you think that's true? Or, how do you feel like people should respond, or even youth in general?
Well, I think there's this saying that people say a lot, is that respectability won't save you. This idea that, just because you have the education, have the right language, know your rights, speak up for yourself, that doesn't necessarily mean that people in positions of power won't still oppress and victimize you. So I do think it's important to understand the law, to learn as much as you can about what your rights are so that you can defend yourself, but understand that sometimes systems of oppression are so pervasive that won't always save your life.
Wow. Well, another reason why we have our guests here with our audience for the kickback is we want to give our teens the opportunity to ask anything they want. So does anyone have any questions?
Well, I just want to ask both of you, any of you guys, how did you get started in the social activist movement? Like, what was the moment that clicked in your head when you decided I need to get up, get off my computer, stop watching TV, and do something?
Well, that's a great question, and I think the beginning of a life of activism begins when you unlearn things. And the education that I got that led me into activism, it didn't come out of the schools. It came out of me thinking critically and looking at the world around me in a way that was upsetting a lot of the conventions that I was taught to accept growing up. So I remember a transformative moment for me in high school was when Hurricane Katrina happened. And I saw like all the images in the media of, you know, black people like in water, you know, searching for food, you know, trying to get to safety. And the media was describing them as refugees. And I felt that was like a perfect illustration of how a lot of the struggles that, you know, our grandparents went through were left, you know, unresolved because the media was still portraying them in this subhuman way. And I felt that from that point forward, I felt I had an obligation to stand up and speak out, you know, whenever I saw injustice, you know, pop up in my life.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's a good one. First of all, thank you for that question. For me, that would have been, honestly, 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I was 22 years old, my 22nd birthday, and I just realized how much, I feel like I consider myself a grown man. I realized how much I didn't know about me. I didn't know who my ancestors were. I didn't know where I was from. And there's a quote that came up from Marcus Garvey that said, people without the knowledge of their history, culture, and origin is like a tree without roots. And I didn't want to be a tree without roots anymore. I wanted to learn my roots. And in doing that, and I suggest everyone do, when you begin to dive into your history, read Marcus Garvey, Asa Hilliard, Dr. King's, Malcolm X, and you begin to study those, you begin to activate that activism that all of our ancestors have left in all of us. And from there, you realize activism is not a choice. It's a responsibility that we all carry. And sometimes the torch is not formally handed to you, but freedom is something that is not earned. It is it's something that's not inherited. It's earned in every generation. And if we want to be free, we have to begin to earn it.
That's totally true.
So my mother worked in social justice for most of my life. She taught anti-oppression work to youth, and she also did reproductive justice. So it was something that I grew up with, that I was always interested in. But it wasn't until later in adulthood that I made the decision to make it my profession, to leave working in corporate America and do nonprofit community work. Because I felt like, you know, often people say, what is the thing that you wake up thinking about and you go to bed thinking about? That's what you should do for a living. And so that's what social justice was for me. But I echo, you know, what the other guests have said, you know, finding a place that you fit, reading and informing yourself, talking to people who are doing the work that you're interested in, volunteering and interning, all of those are really great ways to find a way to get involved at whatever level you feel like is comfortable for you.
That's just, it's so empowering. We're so lucky to have these amazing experts and audience participate with us.
Yes, give us
Like,
a round
that
of
was
applause. You guys have been awesome
to have these conversations.
And we will see you next time on
Fusion Talk Show.